The courtroom buzzed with the usual hum of activity. Papers shuffling, murmurs of attorneys preparing their cases, and the sound of footsteps echoing off the tiled floors. Judge Thomas Westbrook, a man in his mid-50s, adjusted his glasses and took his seat at the bench. Known for his methodical approach to cases and his no-nonsense attitude, he was respected by his colleagues, but today he felt the weight of a long day pressing on him. The case before him was simple, or so he thought. Marissa Hayes, a black woman in her early 40s, stood before him, her posture straight, her eyes calm. She was the owner of a small financial consulting firm, but at first glance, she seemed like just another business owner caught in the crossfire of bureaucracy. The papers in front of the judge outlined a minor discrepancy in her business's tax filings, a clerical error that had resulted in some underpayment of taxes. It wasn't the first case of its kind, and it wouldn't be the last. As the prosecution spoke, highlighting the amount of money owed and the need for accountability, Marissa remained composed. Her suit was well-tailored, but not flashy. Her hair was pulled back neatly, her expression focused. Judge Westbrook couldn't help but notice how calm she was under pressure, but he attributed it to the professional demeanor expected of anyone standing in his courtroom. She didn't look like someone who would make a scene, but that wasn't what he was concerned with. What mattered now was enforcing the law. "Ms. Hayes," the judge called, his voice firm but not unkind. "This is a serious matter. The underpayment is not insignificant, and as much as I understand mistakes happen, the law must be upheld." Marissa met his gaze, her response measured. "I understand, Your Honor. The mistake was unintentional, and I've already corrected the error. I've also put measures in place to ensure this doesn't happen again." Judge Westbrook nodded slightly but remained unmoved. "You'll have to pay the penalty as stipulated. However, I suggest you take this as an opportunity to review your financial practices to avoid further complications." A slight pause hung in the air as Marissa processed his words. Her lips tightened for a moment, but she nodded. "I will, Your Honor." Westbrook then set the fine, a substantial sum that would likely put a strain on her business. The amount was typical for cases like hers, nothing outrageous in the grand scheme of things, but still enough to be burdensome. With a sense of finality, he banged the gavel. "Court is adjourned," the judge announced, and the room started to empty. But as Marissa walked away, there was a flicker of something deeper behind her eyes. Judge Westbrook couldn't quite place it, but it nagged at him. Something in her calm demeanor seemed almost too composed, too professional for someone in her position. Little did he know, this would be the start of a journey that would change his understanding of both her and the impact of his decision. Marissa Hayes stepped out of the courtroom, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor as she walked toward the exit. Her mind was already moving forward, focusing on what came next. She had learned early in life how to compartmentalize, how to push past challenges, and how to take responsibility for her actions. But today, something felt different. The fine that had been imposed on her was a minor setback, but it wasn't the first time she had encountered such roadblocks. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd been misjudged. Born and raised in a small neighborhood on the outskirts of a bustling city, Marissa knew firsthand what it felt like to face economic disparities. Her family had always struggled to make ends meet, but her parents had instilled in her a deep belief in the power of education and hard work. Marissa excelled in school, her aptitude for numbers and problem-solving evident from an early age. By the time she graduated college, she had already developed a passion for finance, a field that fascinated her with its complexities and potential for change. But Marissa wasn't interested in finance just for personal gain. She saw the systemic issues within the financial industry, the barriers that kept small businesses and underserved communities from accessing the resources they needed to thrive. It was this realization that drove her to take a different path. Rather than following the conventional route into high-paying corporate jobs, she founded her own consulting firm, focusing on helping small business owners navigate the complicated world of finance. She became a trusted advisor, known for her sharp insights and innovative strategies. Over the years, Marissa's influence grew, and so did her commitment to reforming the financial landscape. She didn't just work with individuals or companies. She became a key player in advocating for changes to federal financial policies. Her voice was often heard in Washington, where she worked alongside lawmakers and regulators to push for more inclusive banking practices. She was instrumental in drafting revisions to federal finance laws that would make it easier for small businesses, especially those in marginalized communities, to access capital and loans. She was often invited to speak at conferences, though her appearances were typically under the radar for those who didn't understand the depth of her work. Despite her professional success, Marissa remained relatively unknown to the public at large. Her work wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about creating tangible change. Yet, she had become a respected figure in financial reform circles, her ideas quietly shaping the future of banking. As she drove away from the courthouse, Marissa reflected on the judge's decision. He had no way of knowing who she truly was or what she had accomplished. To him, she was just another business owner caught up in a minor financial oversight. But Marissa understood that this wasn't about the fine. It was about the way people like her were often overlooked or underestimated. She had been determined to prove that those who were dismissed could, in fact, shape the world in ways others never imagined. And someday, Judge Westbrook would understand that too. A week after the court hearing, Judge Thomas Westbrook found himself seated in a grand hall, the low murmur of conversations around him as the annual Economic Reform Summit got underway. The event was filled with government officials, business leaders, and experts from various fields, all gathered to discuss the future of finance. The judge, typically more comfortable in the courtroom than in settings like this, was there on a personal invitation. He had recently expressed an interest in understanding how economic reforms could influence legal decisions, and now he was eager to hear from experts about the evolving landscape of finance. As he settled into his seat, flipping through the program, he was interrupted by the hum of the crowd rising in anticipation. The keynote speaker had been introduced. The name on the screen caught his attention: Marissa Hayes. He paused, blinking. The name was familiar, and his mind immediately flashed to the recent case he had presided over. Could it be the same Marissa Hayes? He wondered. His thoughts began to swirl. She was the woman from the courtroom, the one he had fined for a tax discrepancy. Could the woman now standing at the podium really be the same person? He sat up straighter as Marissa began speaking. There was an undeniable confidence in her voice, a clarity that captured the attention of everyone in the room. She didn't just speak about economic reform, she embodied it. Her words weren't about the dry technicalities of financial policy, but about the real human lives affected by those policies. Today, we stand at the crossroads of a financial revolution, she said, her voice resonating through the microphone. For too long, the systems in place have favored the few, leaving small businesses and marginalized communities to navigate a maze of obstacles. It's time for a change, one that ensures opportunity for all. The judge listened intently, captivated by her passion. Marissa's expertise was evident, but what struck him most was the depth of her understanding, not just of finance, but of the people impacted by it. She spoke with a sincerity that was impossible to ignore, and her words lingered in the air long after the crowd's applause had faded. As she continued her talk, Westbrook found himself wrestling with a growing realization. He had made a grave misjudgment. The woman he had fined just days earlier wasn't just a business owner struggling with minor paperwork. She was a leader, a catalyst for change in a field that affected millions. He hadn't recognized her influence in the courtroom, hadn't seen the full picture of who she was, what she stood for, or what she had accomplished. The more he listened, the more it dawned on him that Marissa Hayes wasn't just a bystander in the financial system. She had helped shape it. Her efforts in advocating for policies that made finance more accessible to small businesses and underserved communities had earned her respect in the highest circles. She wasn't just an expert, she was a visionary. Judge Westbrook's mind raced as he processed this new information. The fine he had imposed felt like a mistake, an oversight that now carried a deeper weight. He had underestimated Marissa Hayes, and he began to wonder how many others had done the same. As the session ended and the audience began to disperse, Westbrook remained seated for a moment longer, his thoughts a tangled mess. He had just come face to face with the true power of the woman he had once viewed as a simple case. Judge Westbrook sat in his office later that evening, the weight of the day's revelations still heavy on his mind. The summit had shaken him more than he cared to admit. Marissa Hayes, the woman he had found only a week ago, was not just a business owner. She was a pioneering force in financial reform. He couldn't get over the feeling that he had misjudged her, quickly labeling her as another small business owner without realizing the magnitude of her work. Unable to shake the nagging curiosity, Westbrook decided to look deeper into her background. He spent the next few hours scouring online articles, interviews, and government reports. The more he read, the more he was astonished by the breadth of her influence. Marissa had founded her consulting firm over a decade ago, but what stood out most in the articles was her consistent advocacy for financial inclusivity. She had worked with legislators, regulatory bodies, and nonprofit organizations to overhaul financial systems that were failing small businesses, particularly those in low-income and marginalized communities. Her advocacy had led to critical revisions in federal banking regulations, making it easier for business owners from all walks of life to access loans, grants, and investment capital. Westbrook found interviews where she spoke passionately about the challenges faced by minority entrepreneurs, about the red tape that prevented them from scaling their businesses, and about her mission to level the playing field. He read about her contributions to the Access to Capital Act, a key piece of legislation that expanded access to low-interest loans for small businesses that had been historically underserved by banks. He found stories of her working with financial institutions to create alternative lending models that prioritized impact over credit scores. It was clear that Marissa wasn't just trying to run a business. She was trying to shift an entire industry toward fairness. Her work didn't stop at the policy level. Marissa had mentored countless young entrepreneurs, teaching them how to navigate the often murky waters of finance. She had hosted workshops, written articles, and spoken at countless conferences, advocating for a more equitable financial ecosystem. Her name had become synonymous with the fight for financial justice, yet few people outside the circles she moved in knew her story. As Westbrook continued his research, a sense of guilt began to gnaw at him. How had he missed all this? How had he overlooked her contributions when she stood right in front of him in that courtroom? The woman who had walked in that day, calm and composed, was a powerhouse of intellect and influence, not just someone facing a minor financial oversight. He leaned back in his chair, a deep sense of regret settling over him. In that moment, Westbrook realized that he hadn't just judged Marissa Hayes harshly. He had failed to see her at all. The fine he had imposed felt increasingly unjust, and he couldn't help but wonder how many others, like him, had overlooked people like her because they didn't fit a familiar mold. The more he learned, the more the judge realized he needed to make things right. But how? What could he do to make up for his mistake? The days following the summit were filled with a growing sense of unease for Judge Westbrook. He had spent hours reflecting on his decision to fine Marissa Hayes, and with each passing day, the weight of his mistakes seemed to intensify. What had seemed like a routine case, just another business owner caught in the web of tax regulations, now felt like a far more significant misjudgment. Westbrook had spent his career priding himself on fairness, on seeing through the surface of cases to understand the deeper story. Yet here he was, having failed to do that with Marissa. He had treated her like any other defendant, not taking the time to recognize the complexity of her role in the financial world. Worse still, his ruling, which had seemed straightforward at the time, now felt like an affront to everything she had worked for. As he sat in his office late one evening, reviewing court transcripts and legal texts, the gnawing guilt in his chest wouldn't subside. Marissa Hayes wasn't just an expert in her field. She was a change-maker. He had underestimated her not because of malice, but because of unconscious bias, assumptions he hadn't even realized he was making. And in doing so, he had made a snap judgment that could have lasting consequences for her. His mind kept returning to the same thought. How many other times had he missed the true story behind the people who came before him? How many others had slipped through the cracks of his courtroom because he didn't take the time to see them fully? It was a humbling realization, one that left him questioning not only his recent actions, but his entire approach to the bench. In the midst of his self-reflection, he also began to think about Marissa herself. Despite the fine, she had taken the decision with remarkable poise. She hadn't protested or argued. She had simply accepted it, no doubt knowing that the system didn't always see her the way it should. Westbrook found himself wondering how many other moments like this had defined her career. How many times had she been overlooked, dismissed, or underestimated because of who she was, rather than the impact she was making? His phone buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. It was a message from a colleague who had been at the summit. "Did you hear Marissa Hayes is being invited to consult on a new federal initiative? The impact she's having on national finance is incredible." The message struck Westbrook with a sudden clarity. Here he was sitting in his office, feeling sorry for himself and wallowing in his mistake, while Marissa was out there, continuing to reshape the very financial landscape he had spent years learning about. The injustice of the fine felt even more apparent now. He closed his eyes for a moment, a resolve building within him. He couldn't undo the past, but he could take responsibility for his actions. He had to find a way to make this right, not just for her, but for himself as well. He reached for his phone and typed a message to Marissa. It wasn't much, but it was a start. "Miss Hayes, I would like to meet with you to discuss an apology for the fine I imposed. I've realized I made a serious mistake, and I would like the chance to make amends." He hit send and sat back in his chair, the first step taken toward the redemption he so desperately needed. But he knew it wouldn't be enough. The real work was just beginning. Marissa Hayes sat in her office, reviewing contracts and client proposals when her phone buzzed. The name on the screen was unexpected. Judge Thomas Westbrook. Her fingers hovered over the screen for a moment, curiosity piqued. She hadn't expected to hear from him again, especially after their brief, impersonal courtroom encounter. She clicked the message open, reading it carefully. "Ms. Hayes, I would like to meet with you to discuss an apology for the fine I imposed. I've realized I made a serious mistake, and I would like the chance to make amends." Marissa was quiet for a moment, letting the message sink in. She hadn't anticipated such an acknowledgement. Most people in positions of power, particularly those in the legal system, were slow to admit fault, if they ever did. She could feel the weight of the words, even through a digital message. This wasn't just an apology. It was an admission of error, a rare and powerful act, especially coming from someone like Judge Westbrook. She hesitated before replying, unsure of what the meeting might entail. Would it be a perfunctory gesture, a simple acknowledgement of a mistake with no real substance behind it? Or would he genuinely seek to understand the harm his decision had caused? After a few moments of thought, Marissa decided it was worth hearing him out. She typed back, "Judge Westbrook, thank you for reaching out. I'm open to meeting with you. Please let me know when would be convenient for you." The reply came swiftly, and they scheduled a meeting for the following afternoon at her office. Marissa, ever the professional, prepared herself for the conversation. She wasn't angry with the judge. After all, her career had taught her how to navigate the complexities of an often unjust system. But she did hope this meeting would go beyond words. She hoped it would serve as an opportunity for real understanding and change. The next day, Judge Westbrook arrived on time, looking somewhat out of place in the modern, sleek office space that Marissa had carefully built over the years. He stood awkwardly at the entrance for a moment, his hands clasped in front of him. His presence was far less imposing than it had been in the courtroom. He wasn't a judge today. He was a man seeking something he hadn't quite figured out. "Ms. Hayes," he began, his voice calm but sincere. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me. I owe you an apology. I made a mistake in the way I handled your case, and I want to make it right." Marissa stood and extended her hand, a gesture of grace. "I appreciate your willingness to admit that, Judge. Please, have a seat." They sat across from each other, a heavy silence hanging between them. Marissa studied him closely, not with judgment but with curiosity. She could see that he wasn't here simply for formality. There was a genuine discomfort in his demeanor, a humbling awareness that had not been there the week before. After a long pause, Westbrook spoke again. "I've spent a lot of time thinking about our interaction in the courtroom. I didn't see you for who you truly are, Ms. Hayes. I saw a business owner, not realizing that you were far more than that. I didn't take the time to understand your work, your contributions, or your influence in financial reform. And for that, I deeply regret the decision I made." Marissa listened, her face unreadable. She knew the words were genuine. There was no trace of defensiveness in his voice, but she couldn't ignore the reality that many others like him would never come to this conclusion. Still, she appreciated the honesty. "I understand, Judge," she said after a moment, "and I appreciate your willingness to listen. But the problem isn't just about one fine. It's about how people like me, and businesses like mine, are often seen through a narrow lens. We're quick to judge based on assumptions, and it takes work to break down those barriers." Westbrook nodded thoughtfully. "You're right. I've been guilty of that myself." Marissa smiled slightly, her voice softening. "We all have. The key is in learning from it. I believe we can both learn from this, and that's a step forward." The judge sat back in his chair, a newfound respect for Marissa dawning in his eyes. Their conversation, one that had started with a mistake, had opened the door to something much more profound, a shared understanding, a bridge between two worlds that had never fully connected before. As the conversation between Judge Westbrook and Marissa Hayes continued, it became clear that the dialogue was no longer just about a mistake in the courtroom. What began as an apology had blossomed into a deeper exchange, a meeting of minds on the complexities of financial systems and the subtle yet pervasive biases that shape them. The judge, once so certain of his position, was now questioning everything he thought he knew about the people he had once presided over. Westbrook found himself drawn in by Marissa's insight. She spoke not just from a place of personal experience, but from a profound understanding of the systemic issues that were often invisible to those in positions of power. Her work, which he had so carelessly dismissed as routine, was a lifeline to small businesses that had been systematically excluded from the resources needed to succeed. Her efforts to reshape the financial system were not just about policy changes. They were about giving people a voice, people who had too often been silenced or ignored. "There's an inherent unfairness in the way the financial system works," Marissa said, leaning forward slightly, her eyes steady. "Small business owners in marginalized communities aren't just battling bad loans or lack of capital. They're battling a system that was never designed to help them in the first place, and the consequences are far-reaching. It affects families, neighborhoods, and entire industries." Westbrook nodded, feeling the growing sense of responsibility. For years, he had been presiding over cases, making judgments without fully understanding the context behind them. He had been focused on the law, on upholding the rules, without always considering the real-life impact of those decisions. "I've heard of these challenges," he said slowly, "but I never saw them through your eyes, Ms. Hayes. It's easy to assume that people just need to fix their financial mistakes, but there's so much more at play. I've realized that now." Marissa smiled faintly, but there was no bitterness in her expression. "That's all any of us can do: learn, grow, and do better. The financial world is complex, but it doesn't have to be unjust." The conversation shifted to practical solutions, how legal and financial frameworks could evolve to serve the needs of small businesses more equitably. Marissa shared insights into upcoming policy changes she was working on, and how judges like Westbrook could play a critical role in supporting these reforms, ensuring that they were enforced with fairness and understanding. She spoke not just about the future of finance, but about the future of society and how interconnected these systems were with social justice and equality. By the end of the meeting, Judge Westbrook felt like a different person. The guilt that had plagued him for days had given way to a sense of purpose. Marissa's words had not only changed his perspective on finance, they had illuminated the larger picture of social responsibility, equity, and the role of the judiciary in advancing justice. He wasn't just a judge anymore. He was part of a much larger conversation, one that required him to do more than simply uphold the law. "I think I've learned more in this conversation than I ever could have anticipated," Westbrook admitted, his voice tinged with humility. Marissa's smile deepened, her gaze warm but resolute. "And this is just the beginning, Judge. We have a long way to go, but it's never too late to start." As he left her office, the weight that had burdened him for so long seemed to lift. He was no longer just a bystander in the courtroom. He was now part of a movement that could, in time, reshape not just the laws, but the very systems that governed people's lives. And with that realization, he knew his work had only just begun. In the weeks following his meeting with Marissa Hayes, Judge Thomas Westbrook found himself reflecting on the conversation more than he had anticipated. What had started as an attempt to make amends for a small misjudgment had evolved into a larger, more personal awakening. Marissa's insights had completely shifted his perspective, not just on the case, but on his entire role within the legal system. Determined to make a difference, Westbrook began taking steps to further his understanding of the financial challenges faced by small business owners, especially those from marginalized communities. He attended more conferences, listened to experts in finance and social justice, and even reached out to other judges to discuss how the law could better reflect the realities of people's lives. Slowly but surely, his approach to the bench began to change. One of the first things he did was revisit the case involving Marissa Hayes. He found himself reviewing the fine he had imposed, the reasoning behind it, and the broader implications of his decision. The more he thought about it, the clearer it became that the punishment had been unjust, not because it was a severe penalty, but because it missed the point entirely. Marissa was a reformer, not a defendant in need of correction. He could not undo the fine, but he knew he had to take a stand to help rewrite the narrative. He drafted a public letter of apology, not just to Marissa, but to anyone who had ever been unfairly treated or underestimated in a courtroom. The letter acknowledged the flaws in his previous judgment and emphasized his commitment to fairness and reform. It was a first step in opening up a broader dialogue about how the legal system could better align with the changing economic and social realities of the world. Meanwhile, Marissa had continued her work, pushing forward with her advocacy and financial reforms. Her influence was growing, and as she had predicted, her efforts were beginning to impact not only small businesses, but also the way lawmakers and financial institutions approached lending and economic policy. She was now a frequent advisor to federal programs aimed at increasing financial accessibility, and her name was becoming synonymous with justice in the financial sector. The ripple effects of her work had reached Westbrook as well. He was invited to collaborate with her on an initiative to train judges across the country on the intersections between law, finance, and social equity. The initiative would aim to teach judges how to approach cases with a broader understanding of the systemic challenges faced by marginalized business owners. When they met again, this time to discuss the initiative, the dynamic between them had shifted. They were no longer just judge and defendant, but colleagues and partners in the pursuit of justice. The conversation was no longer about apologies or mistakes, but about forging a path forward together. "I never imagined that one case would lead me here," Westbrook confessed during their meeting, a quiet sense of gratitude in his voice. "But I'm glad it did." Marissa smiled, the same determination in her eyes. "It's never too late to change, Judge. The real work is just beginning." And with that, they both knew that the journey they had started would continue to evolve, an enduring partnership rooted in understanding, respect, and a shared vision for a more equitable future.